Hi, guys. So you are a little bit further in Catcher in the Rye at this point, and you're getting to know Holden a lot better. And he is a super sophisticated character. When we talked about Catcher in the Rye, we were talking about the idea that Holden was really one of the first adolescent characters that was presented in a youth novel. Youth novels weren't a big thing in the 1950s. Youth didn't really have a voice back there. So The Catcher in the Rye is a classic book on many different levels, but first and foremost, probably because it was the first time an author felt that it was important to give a voice to a young man growing up in a situation where he felt really uncomfortable and again didn't have that ability to talk for himself. So Salinger gave Holden a voice. It's interesting as you're reading now and getting to know Holden more and more. I think you're starting to see this idea of a story within a story start to evolve. The Catcher in the Rye is what we call a frame narrative. And a frame narrative is a literary technique where there's a story embedded in the main story. And in the case of Holden, it's a series of vignettes about his youth and his childhood that gives us a lot of insight into him as a person. I think it's really interesting to think about Holden as a person that has this really, really tough pseudo set of armor on. He has been hurt in the past, he's felt alienated, and he has this armor up to keep people away from him. I think I always look at Holden as a person who wants to be the first to lash out so someone can't hurt him. There's different techniques that are used when you're writing a frame narrative. And the first one is to firm up the themes, meaning the ideas in the inner story need to match those in the outer story. And I think it's really important to kind of think about what the author is trying to do in terms of the inner story, maybe even more than the outer story. Why is this inner story embedded in the story? What is it? What is he trying to say through it? In the case of Holden, because he finds the future so scary and the idea of making a move or knowing what he wants to do, he kind of really feels super secure in images from the past, things that can't change, things that no longer have an ability to change. And that's where he feels the most content, the happiest. And that gives us a lot of insight, perhaps, to why he feels so uneasy in the skin he's in right now. You have to really make sure that the voices fuse. And that means they don't have to be identical. In the case of Holden, a lot of the vignettes are told about an earlier time in his life. But they have to sound like the same character. I think the thing that's really interesting to note when Holden's telling a story from his past, especially in his youth when he's much younger, his voice is much more endearing. It's much more serene than the voice that we hear from Holden as an adolescent. And you can even see that there are some stories about his more recent past that he has a similar tone to the tone that he has in the story that's taking place over the couple of days in New York. But when he goes further back in the timeline, he seems a lot more content, and there's a sweetness about Holden that we don't often see in the main story. I think it's really important that the author plots the timelines or makes them match up to certain points in the story. And like I said, in terms of Holden, it's not always chronological. The inner story is not always chronological. How I look at the inner story is more of a stream of consciousness of little vignettes that match up to moments in the main story that again make sense and give us some insight into Holden and the way he thinks about things. But it is important again to marry those plot points up to what is going on in your story. In terms of both stories, it is important that you would be able to pull the inner story out from the outer story. This is kind of like peeling the orange, right? And in some frame narratives, the inner story is super chronological and it's almost like a story in itself. I always think that Catcher in the Rye doesn't really work that way. For me, the inner story is almost like a journal. It's almost like Holden's diary, that he's writing about things that mean a lot to him or have super significance in his ability to know himself. So the inner story would read much, much more like a journal. It reminds me very much of Perks of Being a Wallflower. Not everything in Charlie's journal is chronological, but there are times in his life that, again, give us a lot of insight into his ability to move forward. So this is a moment from chapter 5, and I just want you to listen to it. It's a moment where Holden is recalling his brother Ali for the first time, and it begins this inner dialogue of a time of Holden's life that was very memorable to him. The thing was, I couldn't think of a room or a house of anything to describe the way Stadletter said he had to have. I'm not too crazy about describing rooms and houses anyway. So what I did, I wrote about my brother Ali's baseball mitt. He was left-handed. The thing that was descriptive about it, though, was that he had poems written all over the fingers and the pocket and everywhere in green ink. He wrote them on it so that he'd have something to read when he was in the field and no one was up at bat. He's dead now. He got leukemia and died when we were in Maine on July 18th, 1946. I was only 13, and they were going to have me psychoanalyzed and all because I broke all the windows in the garage. I don't blame them. I really don't. I slept in the garage the night he died, and I broke all the goddamn windows with my fists just for the hell of it. I even tried to break all the windows on the station wagon we had that summer, but my hand was already broken and everything by that time, and I couldn't do it. It was a very stupid thing to do, I'll admit, but I hardly didn't even know I was doing it. And you didn't know Ali. My hand still hurts me once in a while, and when it rains and all. And I can't make a real fist anymore, not a tight one, I mean. But outside of that, I don't care much. I mean, I'm not going to be a goddamn surgeon or a violinist or anything anyway. So it's interesting to look at the consistency, I think, in the outer story and the inner story. So again, when he talks about his siblings, when he talks about Ali and Phoebe and DB, he really, really has high praise for them, even though he gets kind of mad at DB for selling out, and that's that whole money thing that we'll talk about later. He really thinks his brother's brilliant. He doesn't speak about Ali or Phoebe like anyone else. He thinks they are the smartest, greatest individuals that ever lived. So here he shows the description of his actions, the great pain that he felt at his brother's death. And it's not really till the end of that piece that he becomes that sarcastic Holden again, that self-deprecating person that says he's not going to be a surgeon or a violinist or anything like that. He's not like his siblings. He's not going to be able to do things like that. So again, when he talks about certain aspects of his life, there's a crack in that fortress, a crack in that armor that allows us to see Holden as the true individual that he really is. So again, think about the novel as you're reading it and these pure, beautiful moments when Holden seems to come out a little bit from this really tough pseudo exterior that he has. And we'll talk about that more as the novel goes on.